before his name was wiped clean from the pages of history, before he was chained, auctioned, and treated like property, there lived a man they whispered about in the dark, a man they called the Beast who never fell. He never asked for fame. He never sought violence. But when the world cornered him, when the men in power decided his fists were worth more than his freedom, they threw him into the ring like an animal made for slaughter. 37 men stepped in front of him. 37 men tried to break him. 37 men never walked back out. And yet, he remained undefeated. But this story isn't just a tale of bloodshed and brute strength. No, it's a story about what a human being becomes when every path to dignity, hope, and survival is stripped away. And the only thing left, the only thing, is the fight. *** before we continue with the story of the man they called the Bayou Giant, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and comment below what state or city you're listening from. Trust me, you'll want to hear every word of what comes next. *** Tonight, we're stepping into a world most history books refuse to touch. A world built on shadows, cruelty, and silence, where the truth wasn't written, it was buried. This was a time when human beings were auctioned like livestock, when families were torn apart with the stroke of a pen, and when the value of a man was measured not by his character, not by his dreams, but by how much profit his suffering could generate. And in that world, there existed another, darker economy, one hidden from polite society. A world where enslaved men were forced into brutal, bare-knuckle arenas, turned into blood sport entertainment for the wealthy. While bets were placed, cheers rose like thunder, and lives were lost for nothing more than spectacle. In the center of that hidden world stood a man whose strength became legend. A man who did not choose violence, but who learned quickly that refusing to fight meant dying with no name, no grave, and no chance of protecting the faint sliver of life he still had. He fought because he had to. He survived because he refused not to. And every victory he earned was not a triumph. It was a shield, a fragile, temporary shield between him and the death waiting on the other side of failure. The men who owned him feared him. The spectators worshipped him. And the whispers that followed him through the plantations and back alley fighting pits carried a name that was never meant to be recorded. The Beast who never fell. So sit back and understand this clearly. This is not the story of a champion, not the story of a hero molded by glory. This is the story of a man who refused to die, a man who survived a world designed to break him, a man whose fists wrote the only history he was ever allowed to have. ***, his story doesn't begin in a fighting ring. It begins in the suffocating darkness of a slave transport wagon, where the air stank of sweat, fear, and iron. Men were shackled so tightly they couldn't stand upright. Women sobbed into their knees. Children whimpered in the corners, too exhausted to cry. And somewhere in that rolling cage of misery sat the man who would one day become the undefeated force they whispered about. Even then, he didn't look like the others. Witnesses, a traitor, a guard, a driver, all described the same first impression in their private notes: a giant. 6'5", maybe 6'6", broad shoulders that looked carved out of oak, arms thick enough that the iron shackles cut into his skin. But it wasn't just his size, it was his silence. While others begged for water, pleaded for rest, screamed when the whips cracked, he sat still, watching, breathing slow, his eyes tracking every movement with the calm focus of a man who refused to give his captors the satisfaction of fear. They beat him for that. Of course they did. Men like them couldn't stand silence, especially from someone they needed to control. One guard wrote in a letter, "There is something wrong about him. He does not flinch when struck. He does not tremble. He only looks." Every lash was meant to break him. Every blow was meant to teach him submission. But the more they tried, the more they failed. The marks on his back healed faster than expected. The bruises faded quickly. And when the wagon stopped at night, while the others collapsed to the ground like lifeless sacks, he stayed upright, shoulders squared, breathing steady, eyes open. Survival for him wasn't instinct. It was defiance. When they finally arrived at the auction block in Louisiana, the crowd leaned forward the moment he stepped off the wagon. Even the auctioneer had to pause. Here was a man built like a fortress, Not loud, not wild, not thrashing, but dangerous in a way the onlookers couldn't quite name. One planter whispered to another, "That one's different. Look at him. He doesn't look owned." But it wasn't merely his size that caught attention. It was the way he endured punishment in the days that followed. They tested him, brutally, whips, clubs, workloads that would cripple an ordinary man. He took it all, not with rage, not with obedience, but with that same heavy stillness he carried on the transport wagon, a stillness that terrified the overseers. And when he finally did react, it wasn't the way they expected. During a punishment session, one meant to teach discipline, the overseer struck him across the face with the butt of a rifle, hard enough to split his lip and stagger him. He turned his head back slowly, wiped the blood with his thumb, and stared. That stare made the overseer step back. That stare started whispers. That stare made one particular plantation owner call him aside that very evening. This man wasn't interested in obedience. He wasn't interested in breaking spirits. He was interested in money. And in Louisiana, hidden behind barns and warehouses, there was an illegal world where men gambled fortunes on human blood. The owner didn't see a slave. He saw a fighter, a weapon, a spectacle. And that night, without the giant knowing it, he had been selected, marked, chosen for a different kind of hell, a hell made of fists, dirt floors, and the roar of men betting on death. This was the moment his story turned. The moment survival would no longer be about chains and whips, but about stepping into the ring. The world he was dragged into next wasn't the fields, and it wasn't the auction block. It was something far darker, something the wealthy plantation owners never spoke of openly, yet celebrated behind locked doors and shuttered barns. They called them fight pits. Not rings, not arenas, pits, dirt floors, rotting wooden rails, lanterns hanging overhead like dying suns. The rich sat in the shadows, sipping whiskey, placing bets as casually as if they were wagering on horse races. Their laughter, their arguments, their shouts, all of it floated above the pit, never touching the men forced to fight beneath them. The fighters didn't enter these pits willingly. They were dragged, shoved, or marched at gunpoint. And the rules were simple. 2 men enter. 1 man leaves. The other doesn't. That was the world he was thrown into. His owner didn't waste time. He wanted a return on investment, and the giant who had survived whips, chains, and impossible labor was about to be tested in a way he never imagined. When the giant stepped into the pit for the first time, he wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a killer. He was just a man standing in the center of a nightmare he didn't yet understand. Across from him stood a seasoned pit fighter, a man smaller in height but hardened, scarred, and desperate, the kind of desperation that makes a person dangerous. His knuckles were already swollen from previous fights. His eyes were hollow, like someone who'd accepted death a long time ago. The crowd leaned in. The overseer yelled, "Begin." The fighter charged. The giant didn't move at first, not because he was brave, but because he was in shock. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't work. This was something new, something primal. The first blow hit him square in the jaw, snapping his head to the side. The second landed on his ribs, forcing a grunt out of him, his first real sound of pain since arriving at the plantation. The crowd roared, but something in him shifted after that. A switch flipped. A buried instinct, one older than chains, older than fear, rose to the surface. He grabbed the smaller fighter by the shoulders, almost on reflex. The man thrashed and swung wildly, but the giant's hands locked like iron. And then, with one explosive motion, he threw his attacker to the ground. The crowd erupted. The smaller fighter scrambled back up, bleeding from the fall. He came again, swinging, clawing, screaming. This time, the giant didn't hesitate. He struck once, twice, massive blows that landed with the weight of a lifetime of held-back rage. The fighter collapsed, gasping, choking on blood, still alive. But the crowd wanted finality. They demanded it. Finish him. Someone shouted. The giant froze. He didn't want this. He didn't want to kill a man who was just as trapped, just as enslaved, just as desperate as he was. But the overseer lifted his rifle toward the giant, and in that moment, he understood. Either he killed, or he died. The decision was made for him. He placed his hand on the beaten fighter's throat, one large, Shaking hand and pressed down until the man stopped moving. The pit fell silent for a moment. Then the rich erupted into cheers. The giant stood there, chest heaving, staring at the still body beneath him. His first kill, and something inside him cracked, not broken, but changed. A part of him shut down, sealed off, because the only way to survive this world was to become what they wanted, or die like the man at his feet. His owner watched from the back of the barn, not with horror, not with pity, but with the cold, calculating smile of a man who realized he had discovered something profitable, something rare, something deadly. The other fighters feared him. The overseers respected him. And the owners? They saw what he was now, a weapon shaped by survival, a fighter born from necessity, a man who could change the entire gambling circuit. This was the birth of the legend, the birth of the undefeated man the whispers would someday call the Bayou Giant. The first kill was only the beginning. Word spread across the plantations faster than any whisper of rebellion ever could. Whispers turned into rumors. Rumors turned into gambling wagers. And in the shadows of Louisiana's sugarcane fields, they began calling him something the newspapers would never print, the Bayou Giant. It wasn't just his size, though. He towered over nearly every man on the plantation. It was the cold certainty in his movements, the way he could read an opponent before the first punch landed, the way he could survive blows that would have broken anyone else. Plantation owners, who had long treated human lives as property, suddenly realized that this man was different, a machine for their entertainment, a source of money, fear, and prestige. The betting began in earnest. Men from towns miles away traveled in wagons, carrying purses full of cash. They came for a glimpse of the undefeated fighter. Some wanted to see him win. Others wanted him to fail. But failure never came. Behind the curtains of celebration, there was a grueling truth. He didn't train like the fighters in modern gyms. He was forced to train. Every day, sunup to sundown, muscle and bone and spirit honed under whips, shouts, and overseer eyes. He didn't ask for glory. He didn't ask for fame. And yet, each punch, each dodge, each block became sharper, faster, deadlier. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was mental. What had started as fear slowly twisted into something darker, calculated survival. Every fight, every opponent, every shouted bet taught him a cruel lesson: to stay alive. He had to become more than human. He had to become a weapon. There were nights when he stared at the stars, questioning what he had become. In the quiet, he could still hear the screams from the pits. He could still feel the weight of those first kills. But survival demanded adaptation. And so he adapted. The Bayou Giant became a legend, not the kind celebrated in songs, not the kind remembered in books, but the kind etched into the fearful whispers of men who watched him fight. Owners flaunted him, paraded him before wealthy gamblers, boasting about their undefeated property. His name became a gamble in itself. Who could face him, and who would fall? Some tried and failed. Some refused to even step into the pit. The chilling truth of his reputation spread beyond the plantations. Other enslaved men whispered about him in secret, their voices barely audible. Some spoke in awe, some in fear, and some in terror, as though speaking his name might summon him to their door. But the Bayou Giant didn't care about admiration. He didn't care about fear. He cared about survival. And each fight, each forced match, each deadly encounter reinforced that one immutable rule: the world will not grant mercy. He must take it, or die. By the time he had fought a dozen men, the pattern was clear. The plantation owners no longer saw him as a man. They saw him as a tool, a weapon forged from chains, cruelty, and sheer instinct. Yet, beneath the fists and the scars, the real man still existed. Buried under layers of pain, rage, and survival instinct, he waited. And every time he stepped into the pit, he reminded the world that a man forced to fight can become more terrifying than anyone who ever tried to control him. This was no longer just survival. It was legend in the making. It was a legacy written in blood, fear, and whispered bets. It was the story of a man who became the most dangerous weapon on the plantation, without ever asking to be. The first time he stepped into the pit, the world was unfamiliar and terrifying. The crowd's cheers blurred into a distant roar as he faced a man twice his size. Fear clenched his chest, but instinct took over. One punch, a stumble, and the man fell, lifeless. Shock froze him. He hadn't wanted death, only survival, but the taste of blood left a mark on his soul. That day, the Bayou Giant realized that fighting wasn't just about skill. It was about living when others expected him to die. By the fourth fight, the whispers had grown louder. One challenger wasn't just another enslaved man, he was a trained boxer, a man of the world outside the plantation. The crowd sneered, betting heavily against the giant. The fight began with calculated jabs and dodges. Every strike landed with precision. When the boxer hit the ground, it wasn't just his defeat, it was the Bayou Giant's first declaration. He was not ordinary. He was unstoppable. The night sky was a thick velvet over the plantation. By cruel twist, he was forced to fight not one, but two men in succession. Exhaustion clawed at him, muscles screaming. The first fell after a series of punishing blows. Barely catching his breath, he faced the second man. The crowd's roar faded, replaced by silence, broken only by the wet smack of fists meeting flesh. Victory came again, but at a cost. Every heartbeat felt like fire. That night, he learned that endurance could be as deadly as strength. Pain had become a constant companion, but it was during the 14th fight that agony nearly broke him. A cruel opponent landed a blow that fractured a rib. Each movement was torture, each strike a gamble with death. The crowd jeered, expecting him to collapse. But with teeth clenched and mind focused, he turned pain into weaponry. Every dodge, every counter, was sharper than ever. When the final punch landed, he was victorious, but the cost was written in every labored breath. By the 22nd fight, fear began to seep into the spectators. Men who had bet against him now watched in terror. They whispered among themselves, glancing at the pit as if a monster had emerged. The fight itself was brutal, but methodical, calculated strikes, careful timing, and the cold resolve that had become his hallmark. For the first time, the Bayou Giant realized that his legend had outgrown the pit. He wasn't just surviving, he was becoming a nightmare in flesh and bone. In his 30th match, something unfamiliar happened. Hesitation. The man in front of him reminded him of someone he once knew, a memory of a life before the chains. For a brief moment, he faltered. The crowd sensed weakness, but instinct snapped back, sharp as a blade. Every strike afterward was fueled not by anger, not by survival, but by pure necessity. When the fight ended, even the owners could sense it. The Bayou Giant was beyond human restraint. The 37th fight was a crescendo of all that had come before. Exhaustion, rage, pain, and unyielding survival instinct collided. His opponent was cunning, cruel, and desperate. Each exchange drew blood, sweat, and raw terror. The crowd watched in horrified awe as the battle pushed both men to their limits. And when the Bayou Giant finally stood victorious, it was more than a win. It was a statement. He had faced death 37 times and emerged not broken, but immortal in fear and legend. Outside the pit, away from the blood-soaked sand and the cheering crowd, the man they called the Bayou Giant was someone else entirely. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't the unstoppable force the owners and gamblers believed him to be. He was quiet, gentle, exhausted in a way that no one could see. Those who glimpsed his life beyond the ring rare as it was saw a man who cherished small moments, a shared glance with the stable boy who cared for the horses, a fleeting smile exchanged with an enslaved woman who smuggled him food or whispered encouragements when the overseers weren't looking. These were the threads of humanity he clung to, the fragile proof that he was more than his fists. And yet, each victory in the pit carried a burden heavier than chains. He carried the weight of every man he had killed. Each fight replayed in his mind late at night, shadows dancing across the cabin walls as if reminding him that survival had a cost. He didn't revel in triumph. He recoiled from it. "I don't want to fight," he whispered once to a friend who dared ask how he bore the violence. "I want to live." And in those words was the truth of every fight, every scar. Every moment of fear turned into a weapon. Survival wasn't glory. It was necessity. And in his heart, there was only one dream: freedom. He dreamed of days where the pit did not exist, where no one would wager on his life, and where he could wake without the taste of blood and sweat hanging in the air. Nights when he could close his eyes without images of fallen men haunting his sleep. He imagined walking through swamps and forests not as a fighter, but as a man free to choose his path, to live instead of merely existing. It's easy to see the Bayou Giant and think of power, fear, invincibility, but the truth was far more human, far more tragic. Behind the legend was a man torn apart by circumstance. Every punch thrown was a scream of desperation. Every victory was a chain heavier than the ones he had been born into. And every night, when the plantation fell silent except for crickets and distant frogs, he lay awake wishing that the world could see him as he truly was, a man who only wanted to breathe, to exist, to live. This is the heart of his story, the man behind the monster. The legend isn't just about undefeated fights or shattered opponents. It's about a soul trapped in a system that demanded he kill to survive. A soul that never lost sight of what mattered most: life, love, and the elusive dream of freedom. For decades, the plantation owners believed they held all the power. They bought him, chained him, and forced him into fights for their amusement and profit. Every punch he threw, every opponent he felled, seemed only to cement their control. Or so they thought. But over time, something changed. The Bayou Giant, the man they had shaped into their ultimate weapon, began to defy expectation. Each victory wasn't just a testament to his strength. It was a reminder that no amount of chains or threats could fully contain him. He was no longer a tool. He was an entity they couldn't predict, a force they couldn't control. And slowly, fear began to creep in. Whispers filled the great halls of the plantation. What if he refuses the next fight? One owner asked. Another muttered, what if he turns on us? Meetings were held in the dead of night, away from the overseers and the slaves. And for the first time, the masters felt powerless. They discussed options in hushed, urgent tones: selling him off to another plantation, killing him before he became too dangerous, or using him for even bigger bets, matches against trained men brought from New Orleans, or even rival states, risking everything for a fortune. Every plan revealed the truth they were terrified to admit: the man they had created to entertain, to kill for sport, and to generate wealth had become untouchable in a way they couldn't manage. The power dynamic had shifted. The Bayou Giant was no longer theirs to command. Each movement he made, each fight he survived, reminded them of it. Fear transformed their respect into paranoia. They watched him constantly, analyzing every glance, every gesture. Was he plotting? Was he planning escape? Could a man like this truly be broken? And deep down, even they knew the horrifying answer: no chain, no whip. No gamble could fully bind him. In the end, the plantation owners had unwittingly done the impossible. They had created a legend. And like most legends, he had outgrown those who tried to control him. They feared the man they had forced into violence more than any opponent he had ever faced in the ring, because unlike the other men, he could not be bought, beaten, or broken. The fight began like all the others, crimson sun casting long shadows across the muddy pit, the roar of the crowd mixing with the sharp cracks of whips and the metallic clink of coins changing hands. But that day, something was different. This was not just another spectacle. He faced two trained fighters, at once a wager larger than anything the plantation had ever seen. Owners and gamblers leaned forward, eyes gleaming with anticipation, certain that even the Bayou Giant had limits. Yet as the bell, or rather, the overseer's shouted command sounded, the world seemed to narrow to just a ring and the man in the center of it. He moved with a precision no one expected, a terrifying dance honed from countless bouts. Blow after blow, he outmaneuvered, outlasted, and ultimately overcame his opponents. But the crowd's cheers, the bets, the friends, and none of it reached him. His mind was elsewhere. Every punch, every grunt of pain from the men he defeated reminded him that his freedom was still chained, just out of reach. Then came the moment that changed everything. Amid the chaos, a sudden surge of instinct, desperation, and raw power made him realize he could do more than survive. He could escape. The overseers shouted, trying to regain control, but for a fleeting heartbeat, it was as if the world paused. For a moment, they saw the man who could kill them all. Eyes widened in disbelief. The masters who had spent years fearing, controlling, and betting on him now glimpsed a truth they had long tried to suppress. This was no longer their property. No longer just a fighter, they saw a human force who could defy them entirely. And in that instant, he glimpsed the possibility of something they had never allowed him: freedom. A near riot erupted. Some spectators screamed in awe, others in terror. The air was thick with tension, and in the frenzy, he slipped past the outer edges of the pit, moving through the shadows like a phantom. For the first time, he imagined life beyond the chains, beyond the ring, beyond the plantation walls that had defined him for so long. That day marked a turning point, not just in the record of his fights, but in the story of the man himself. It was a revelation of his power, yes, but also of his humanity. For the owners, it was a terrifying reminder that control is an illusion. For him, it was the spark of hope, the first taste of autonomy he had ever known. Though history would try to erase his name, the echoes of that final turning point survived. The legend of the Bayou Giant, the man who fought 37 times, defeated all, and almost broke free, remains buried in whispers, journals, and hidden estate records. And while the chains could hold his body, they could never hold the story of the man who refused to be broken. After that final turning point, the Bayou Giant disappeared from the public eye. Some say he slipped into the swamps of Louisiana under cover of night, vanishing like a ghost. Rumors spread through the plantations, whispers of a man who fought 37 times and defied every chain, now walking free somewhere beyond the reach of the masters who had sought to control him. Others claim a darker fate, that the very people who profited from his violence feared what he represented: strength that could not be contained. They allegedly hunted him down, striking him before he could vanish entirely, burying him in unmarked soil, and ensuring that the legend never threatened the order of their world again. In that silence, his story became a secret carefully hidden from the public eye, erased from newspapers, ledgers, and plantation records. Some historians suggest a third possibility, that he was sold far away, given a new name, a new life, and deliberately erased from the historical narrative. His strength, his victories, and even his humanity were rewritten as an untraceable footnote, an example of how oppressed voices are systematically removed from history. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest irony. A man who survived impossible odds, who became more than a fighter, whose very existence defied control, ended up as a shadow in the records. History did not want to remember him, because to remember him is to acknowledge the cost of human cruelty and the resilience it cannot contain. Yet, despite centuries of erasure, fragments remain. Journals hidden in attics, estate documents tucked away in archives, testimonies passed down quietly through families. They remind us that the Bayou Giant existed, that his fists struck for survival, and that his spirit refused to be fully chained. What became of him? Freedom, death, or anonymity? We may never know for certain, but the essence of his story endures, a tale of strength, resilience, and the unbreakable will of a human being forced into a world of cruelty. In the end, the man behind the fists remains, even if the records do not, and that's why we remember him today, not just as a fighter, but as a symbol of resistance, survival, and the voices history tried to silence. Even centuries later, the story of the Bayou Giant matters not because of the victories recorded, but because of the life he was forced to live. He was not born to be a weapon. He did not ask for fame, glory, or notoriety. And yet, the world around him left him no choice but to fight, to survive, and to endure horrors no human should face. His story is a mirror. It reflects the cruelty of a system that commodified human lives, turning men into spectacles for the amusement of the powerful. It reminds us of the lengths people will go to control others, to bend strength and spirit into something profitable, even if it destroys the person inside. But it is also a story of resilience, of someone who refused to be broken, who survived when the odds were stacked impossibly against him, and who carried his humanity quietly, privately, through every trial. Every punch he threw, every fight he survived, was not just an act of violence, it was an act of defiance, a statement that he would not be entirely consumed by the world that sought to enslave him. And there is a lesson in his silence. The Bayou Giant did not seek revenge. He sought life, freedom, the simple, profound right to exist on his own terms, even without recognition, even erased from official records. His story survives because human memory, human conscience, refuses to forget acts of courage and endurance. So when we look back on his life, we see more than the fists, the fights, or the fear he inspired. We see a human being forced into a role he never wanted, and yet navigating it with strength, dignity, and a will to survive. His legacy is not measured in the number of men he defeated, but in the spirit he preserved in a world determined to strip it away. Let this story stay with us not just as a tale of brutality, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Let it remind us to remember the forgotten, to listen to the silenced, and to honor those whose lives were written out of history. The Bayou Giant may not have a monument or a recorded grave, but his courage, his pain, and his unbroken will continue to echo through the whispers of history, through the fragments of hidden documents, and through stories like this one. Because remembering him is more than honoring a fighter, it is honoring the enduring strength of humanity itself.